Welcome to the Cozy Storytime, your peaceful space to unwind and relax. Before we start, make sure to subscribe and like the video for more cozy stories every night. So, where are you watching it from? And what are you doing right now? I hope you enjoyed this story. Tonight, we'll journey to the misty hills and ancient forests of old Ireland. A time when gods walked among mortals, when magic lived in every stone, and the wind carried the songs of warriors and healers alike. Close your eyes. Let the quiet surround you. Breathe in deeply, and as you breathe out, let the weight of your day gently drift away. This is the tale of the Tuatha Dé Danann, a radiant people of wisdom and wonder who crossed the western seas to find their destined land. A story of courage, unity, and the eternal light that glows even in the shadow of war. Let your mind rest here for a while. Let the rhythm of the words carry you. And when sleep finds you, may your dreams be filled with soft green hills, ancient songs, and a gentle kind of magic. Now, let's begin. Upon one another, before the names of men were carved into the trees and fields of air, there came a whisper on the wind. It began softly, like the hush of leaves brushing one another in the quiet of dawn. Then came the light, silver and golden, shimmering over the hills and streams, a glow that the people of the land would never forget, even when the stories faded into mist. From the clouds above, where rain and rainbow dance, a host descended, not of ordinary beings, but of those touched by the deep magic of the world. They were called the Tuatha Dé Danann, the people of the goddess Danu, and they arrived not in ships of wood and sail, but in floating vessels that glimmered like starlight made solid. It was said they did not sail the sea but rode the sky itself, their arrival veiled in clouds so thick and enchanted, the sun dimmed in reverence. The land trembled, not in fear, but in anticipation. The earth knew its own children were returning. No one could say exactly from where they had come. Some whispered they came from Tuatha Dé Danann, the land of eternal youth, far to the west beyond the mortal horizon. Others believed they had journeyed through realms unseen by human eyes, through folds in time and space where thought and reality twisted into one. But what all could agree upon was that they were not like other folk. Tall, graceful, and radiant with the presence of power, the Tuatha Dé Danann were beings who carried magic in their breath and wisdom in their bones. Their eyes shone like stars glimpsed in still water, and their voices, even when quiet, stirred the heart. They wore robes of woven mist and armor that flickered between silver and shadow. In their hands, they brought relics unlike any seen by mortal men, artifacts of immense beauty and unimaginable might. The first was the stone of Fowl, which would cry out beneath the feet of the rightful king. The second, the sword of Nuada, sharp enough to cut through truth and lie alike, leaving only clarity. The third, the spear of Luff, which never missed its mark and returned always to its owner's hand. And last, the cauldron of the Dagda, from which no host ever went hungry, and which healed and restored any who drank from it. With these treasures, the Tuatha brought not only wonder, but purpose, gifts to shape the land and those who dwelled within it. When they first touched the soil of Ireland, the wind slowed to listen. The clouds broke above them like curtains drawn from a stage, revealing a sky painted in twilight hues. Beneath their feet, the grass grew greener, the rivers clearer, and the stones warmer. The air grew richer, as though the land itself breathed more deeply in their presence. Their leader was Nuada, the silver-handed, a king of great dignity and compassion. His gaze held both the weight of ages past and the promise of futures yet to be born. By his side stood the great Dagda, the All-Father, with a belly round from laughter and a heart deep as the ocean. He carried a harp that could stir men to tears or lull them to sleep, and a club that could both slay and revive. Beside them came Dien Sek, the healer whose hands could mend what the world had broken, and Ogma, the wordsmith, whose tongue could charm the fiercest of warriors into peace. Among them also were women of unmatched power, Bridget, the radiant flame of inspiration, who guided poets and smiths alike, Ariu, whose name the land itself would come to bear, and Morrigan, the veiled prophetess of fate and shadow, who saw the strands of time woven before they were ever lived. Together, this wondrous host moved gently across the hills and moors, observing the land with reverence. They did not claim the earth, not at first, for they knew it must be earned, not taken. They studied its stones, its rivers, its ancient trees that whispered secrets of those who lived before. They listened to the birdsong, to the call of wolves in the distant forests, to the low hum of magic that still slept beneath the surface of the soil. And they waited for the land to speak back, for the balance to be right. But not all watched their descent with joy. Beyond the quiet hills, in shadows where the sea met rock, others stirred. The world was not empty. The Tuatha Dé Danann had not arrived in a vacuum. The land was already lived in by peoples who had fought their own battles, spilled their own blood, and told their own stories beneath the stars. The arrival of these shining ones was not just a marvel, it was an omen. A change was coming, and the old order shivered. Still, in the earliest days, there was peace. The Tuatha built no towering citadels, nor did they demand obedience. Instead, they lit fires in circles of stone and sang songs older than the memory of men. They taught animals to trust again, plants to bloom in rhythm with the moon. Where they walked, crops grew wild and rich, and the sick rose from their beds with color in their cheeks. Magic did not blaze, it hummed, soft and steady, like a lullaby to the land. Children who wandered too far from home would sometimes find themselves standing near a ring of trees that hadn't been there before, only to see a figure of light watching from within, offering a smile and a blessing before fading with the wind. Farmers would wake to find their fields perfectly furrowed, their tools sharpened and glistening with dew. These were quiet miracles, kindnesses shared by a people who remembered what it was to be caretakers, not conquerors. But in their hearts, the Tuatha Dé Danann knew this calm could not last forever. They had not come merely to settle. They had come because they were called. A voice older than time had whispered to them through the void, the land needed guardians, and the balance had begun to shift. Somewhere, in the deep places of the world, something stirred, something ancient, cold, and cruel. And so, even in peace, they prepared. They trained beneath the moon, dancing through mists with blades that hummed with magic. They studied stars and stones, seeking signs of what might come. Their druids communed with wind and water, and their poets sang of destinies yet unwritten. The Tuatha Dé Danann were not merely a people, they were a promise. A promise that when darkness came to claim the land, there would be light to meet it. And so, as night fell across the hills and stars blinked into the sky like distant eyes, the land of Ireland held its breath. The Tuatha Dé Danann had arrived. The wind carried their names, the trees whispered their stories, and the rivers mirrored their radiance. The story had only just begun. The soft touch of twilight settled gently over the hills and rivers of air. The Tuatha Dé Danann, radiant and otherworldly, had begun to find quiet corners to rest, to listen, and to understand the rhythm of the land they had descended upon. For days, they moved like dreams through the forests and fields, avoiding paths worn by men and watching the sky turning golden arcs above them. The land welcomed them with curious warmth, but the land, as they soon learned, was not empty. It began with echoes, distant sounds at the edge of the wind. Voices, not theirs, rough and grounded in the earth. Smoke rising from places unseen. Tools ringing on stone. The Tuatha Dé Danann had come from distant realms of magic and silence, where nature bowed to their touch. But this land, while ancient and full of wonder, held its own stories. And some of those stories were still being lived. In a broad valley where the grass grew tall and wildflowers scattered like confetti, a group of Tuatha had paused to rest. They were unarmed, their laughter low, their presence almost too gentle to disturb the breeze. But then the dogs came, lean, sharp-eyed beasts, barking and circling just beyond the tree line. Moments later, men emerged from the brush. They were not like the Tuatha. They were shorter, rougher in form, their faces etched by wind and sun, their clothing sewn from animal hide and woven reed. Spears were clutched in hand, not raised, but firm with suspicion. The Tuatha rose calmly. They did not reach for weapons, none were needed. Magic hung about them like perfume, soft and intoxicating. One among them, a poet named Yechu, stepped forward and bowed gently, his hand resting over his heart. "We mean you no harm," he said, his voice carrying like song. "We are travelers, newcomers. We come to know this land, not to take it." The leader of the men stepped forward, a broad-shouldered figure with hair as dark as peat and a beard like sea foam. He wore a necklace of bone and shell, and his eyes were not unkind, only wary. "This land is not empty," the man said. His voice was like gravel, honest and hard. "We have named its rivers. We have buried our dead beneath its stones. Who are you, to walk upon it as though it calls to you?" And so the truth was laid bare. The Tuatha Dé Danann, in all their grace and power, had not arrived in a forgotten wilderness. The land was already lived in, its name known and spoken. The people who stood before them called themselves the Furbolg, a strong and enduring people, descended from the old tribes who had wandered far and suffered greatly. Once slaves across the sea, they had fled and found solace in this green island. Here, they had built homes, carved boundaries, and raised children who knew the taste of honey and the sting of bramble. Nuada, king of the Tuatha Dé Danann, listened carefully when this news reached him. There was no arrogance in his heart, no desire to conquer for pride or greed. He summoned his counselors, wise ones and dream seers, and they gathered beneath an ancient yew tree whose branches reached out like fingers of time. "What is our purpose here?" Nuada asked, "if the land has already chosen its keepers?" The answers did not come swiftly. Some among the Tuatha suggested they turn back, that the balance must be preserved, and their presence might unweave what had already been woven. Others believed they were called for a reason, not to displace, but to guide, to share their magic and their wisdom with the people of air. After all, had they not followed visions? Had they not been summoned in dreams by rivers that whispered their names? And so, messengers were sent, not with demands, but with invitations. Nuada himself stood before the Furbolg elders, in a stone ring where moss grew thick and the sun dappled the ground like gold through stained glass. With him were Luff, the shining youth of many talents, and Bridget, whose presence felt like spring. "We seek not to take what is not ours," Nuada said, his voice steady. "We come with gifts. Knowledge, healing, music, and craft. Let us share this land. Let us live as kin, not enemies. But the Firbolg elders, while impressed, were not easily swayed. They had fought for every inch of their homeland. They had sailed stormy seas, buried their dead, and written their stories into the soil. To share was to risk. To yield, even a little, felt like erasure. One elder, a quiet man named Srang, stood and spoke with a strength that echoed through the grove. You are powerful. You are beautiful. But you are many, and we do not know your hearts. Will your children remember peace when we are gone? Will your promises be remembered by those who come after? It was a fair question. The Tuatha Dé Danann could not promise forever. Even their long lives could not ensure that harmony would always hold. But they knew this moment mattered. It would be the thread upon which the tapestry of the future was woven. Eventually, a meeting was arranged. Not a war council, not yet, but a test of trust. Warriors from both sides would meet in the open, no ambush, no deception. A circle of truce was drawn with ash branches and salt. Inside it, they would speak plainly and see if a path could be forged. It was there, beneath a sky streaked with red and gold, that Tuatha and Srang met face to face. They stood as equals, each bearing the weight of their people's hopes. Tuatha offered wine brewed with heather and song. Srang offered bread kneaded with the sweat of honest labor. And still, words faltered. The truth was simple and painful. Two peoples, one land. Neither sought destruction, yet neither would yield. And so, as twilight gave way to night, a soft decision was made, not out of hatred, but necessity. A contest, not of revenge, but of right. A battle to decide what the land itself desired. The Firbolg, defenders of their ancestral soil. The Tuatha Dé Danann, bearers of light and wonder. Not yet war, but a reckoning. When Tuatha returned to his camp, he stood in silence beneath the stars. He did not fear what was coming, but he mourned the loss of what might have been a peaceful union, untouched by blade or spell. Still, he whispered to the wind, "Let us meet with honor. Let us fight not in anger, but in truth. And may the land itself choose its future." And somewhere, deep in the soil and stone of Ireland, something ancient listened. Dawn broke over the valley of Mag Twyred with the kind of hush that only precedes something great. It was a silence that seemed to hang in the air like morning mist, delicate, heavy with anticipation. The birds did not sing that morning. The deer in the glen watched from the shadows, and even the wind moved softly, as though not to disturb what was to come. In the days that followed the failed accord, the Tuatha Dé Danann and the Firbolg had returned to their camps not as enemies filled with rage, but as people preparing for the way of destiny. Neither side had sought violence, but both knew the decision could no longer be made with words alone. The land was not wide enough to hold two peoples unwilling to be ruled. And so, it would be battle, not born of hate, but of necessity, and perhaps of fate. The place was chosen carefully, Mag Twyred, a wide, open plain in the north of Ayr, where the earth rolled in long hills and the grass bowed low to the breeze. The druids of both sides agreed this was a land where truth would rise and deception would fall away. It was sacred, old even before men had given it a name. Here, the gods would see clearly. Here, the land itself would watch. The Tuatha Dé Danann did not rush to war. They prepared with ceremony, bathing in the rivers, invoking the elements, and adorning themselves not in terrifying armor, but in symbols of their houses, their hopes, and the blessings of Danu. Their warriors carried swords that shimmered faintly in moonlight, their edges kissed with spells. Their shields bore the sigils of wind, fire, and thought. Among them stood Tuatha, their king, calm and steady as the mountain, and the great warrior Ogma, with his deep-set eyes and hands strong from both battle and poetry. The Furbolg, too, readied themselves not in blind fury, but with the resolve of people who knew the worth of home. They wore leather and hide, armor patched and worn, not gleaming but reliable. Their spears were forged in fire, sharpened by hand, and passed down through generations. They moved as one, solid, grounded, like the stone beneath the soil. At their front stood Srang, the proud warrior who had spoken with Tuatha beneath the ash tree. In his hand was a great bronze blade, broad and unadorned, but strong enough to split oak. On the eve before the battle, both camps were quiet. There was no singing, only the sound of sharpening steel, whispered prayers, and the rustle of banners catching the wind. Children and elders had been moved far from the field. This would not be a fight for land alone, it would be a battle for legacy and for memory. Whoever stood when the dust settled would carry the right to shape the story of the land. When the sun rose, both armies stood in formation across the plain. The sky was wide and cloudless, as though it too had drawn its breath. The Tuatha Dé Danann glowed in the morning light, their armor and spears reflecting hues of sky and flame. Opposite them, the Furbolg stood like a wall, firm, dark against the gold of the grass, their eyes steady, their silence louder than any war cry. Tuatha stepped forward first, as was custom among those who honored the old ways. He raised his sword, not in threat, but in declaration. "This is not a war of destruction," he called, his voice like a clear bell across the hills. "We are not here to erase, but to decide. Let the land choose, and let all who fall be remembered with honor." Srang stepped out in turn. His voice was rougher, deep with emotion, but it carried just as far. "We defend what was earned. We fight not because we desire to kill, but because we must protect. If we fall as those who stood with the earth beneath their feet." And with that, the drums began, not loud, but low and steady, echoing the beat of a heart. The first clash was like thunder splitting the sky. The warriors met with a force that shook the plain. Blades rang against shields, spears danced in arcs of light, and the ground beneath them churned under the feet of hundreds. Magic flowed from the hands of the Tuatha, winds that bent arrows, light that dazzled the eye, songs that strengthened the weary. The Furbolg, though less magical, were no less mighty. They fought with the fury of survival, the determination of those who had nowhere else to go. For hours, the battle surged back and forth like the tide. Neither side gained ground for long. At times, it seemed as if the very land held its breath, unsure of whom to favor. Cries of valor rang out. Champions on both sides rose and fell. Brothers fought beside brothers, friends held each other in the mud, and when death came, it came quickly and often with dignity. Then came the duel. Tuatha, the king of the Tuatha Dé Danann, found himself face to face with Srang, the warrior of the Furbolg. No one interfered. All around, the battle paused, as if every soul knew that this moment mattered more than all the others. Tuatha, tall and shining, raised his sword in salute. Srang, broad and unyielding, did the same. Their blades met in a dance of fury and grace. Tuatha moved like wind over water, swift, precise. Strang struck like thunder, each blow deep and forceful. For a time, they were evenly matched, the beauty of magic and the strength of will entwined. But fate, it seemed, had tilted the scale. In a sudden strike, Strang's heavy blade crashed down with devastating force. Tuatha blocked, but not well enough. The blow struck his arm, and the sword of the Tuatha flew from his grip. When Tuatha rose, his arm, his right arm, his sword arm, was gone, severed just above the elbow. Blood soaked into the earth. A gasp rose from both armies. The king was wounded. Strang, panting, stepped back. He did not press the attack. "You are brave," he said, "and now you are wounded. In this, let us not spill more blood than we must." But Tuatha did not fall. Even bleeding, even broken, he stood tall. "I am not my arm," he whispered, "and I am not yet finished." The fighting resumed, but the tide had turned. Though Tuatha was taken from the field, the warriors of the Tuatha Dé Danann surged forward and raged not with hate, but with resolve. They fought for their king, for the vision they carried, for the future they dreamed. By dusk, the Firbolg could fight no more. Their numbers had thinned, their strength waned. Though brave to the last, they knelt at the end, not in surrender, but in recognition of the end of their time as sole keepers of the land. The Tuatha Dé Danann did not jeer. They did not gloat. They offered healing, food, and peace. Strang, though defeated, was treated as a hero. The Firbolg were given land of their own, Connaught, in the west, where they could live with dignity and remembrance. And so, the battle ended. Not with annihilation, but with honor. Not with bitterness, but with beginning. The first battle of Mag Tuired became more than a clash of peoples. It became the story of how a land made room for change, and how even in conflict, respect can take root. As stars lit the sky that night, and the cries of the fallen were sung into the winds, Ireland turned a page in its ancient story. And far beneath the soil, the spirit of the island stirred, awake, aware, and watching still. The valley of Mag Tuired lay quiet in the days after the battle. The air was thick with memory, of blood spilled and promises whispered, of blades that rang with truth rather than vengeance. Though the cries of warriors had faded, the land still held their echoes, tucked into the folds of hills and the shallow dips of old battle scars. The Tuatha Dé Danann had emerged victorious, but their joy was muted. They had not danced in celebration, nor raised songs of conquest. Instead, they tended the wounded, buried the fallen with solemn rites, and ensured that even the Firbolg, brave and steadfast in defeat, were honored in memory. And amid this quiet aftermath, a deeper sorrow lingered. Tuatha, their king, lay in silence. He had not died that day, though many thought he might. The blow dealt to him by Strang had been clean but devastating, severing his right arm at the shoulder. The healers had worked quickly, guided by magic and gentle hands, to close the wound and ease his pain. But no spell could undo the truth of it. Tuatha was no longer whole. In the world of the Tuatha Dé Danann, kings were not merely rulers, they were symbols of the land itself, their bodies mirrors of the harmony they were meant to protect. A blemished king, one with a lasting wound or missing limb, was believed to reflect a blemish in the kingdom's heart. It was an old belief, rooted in ritual, and though many questioned it quietly, none dared to dismiss it aloud. So, as the fires burned low and the people returned from the field of battle, Tuatha remained in his tent, wrapped in silence and thought. His tent was not large or adorned like a king's chamber might be. He had asked for simplicity, furs laid upon the earth, a bowl of water drawn fresh each morning, and a single candle lit beside his bed. The flame flickered gently, casting golden light on the curve of his cheek and the long, silver hair that spilled across his shoulders. Each morning, Bridgie visited him. She brought him herbs for the pain, warm broths, and stories from the camp. She never pressed him to speak, though sometimes he would, softly, always softly. "I can still feel it," he said once, staring at the space where his arm had been. "The weight of the sword. The wind on my hand. Those sensations." Bridget only nodded, setting down a bowl of honeyed oats. The body remembers, even when the body is changed. Other days, Odma came and sat beside him, speaking of poetry, of new songs being written to honor those lost. Sometimes, he would take up his harp and play a quiet melody, something not meant to inspire, but to comfort. But it was Dien Sect, the great healer of the Tuatha Dé Danann, who finally brought the words no one else had dared speak. "It is time to name a new king," he said, his voice low but steady. "The laws are clear, Tuatha. A king must be whole. You cannot bear the crown with only one hand." Tuatha did not argue. He only looked down at his remaining hand, fingers curled in the wool of his cloak. "Who?" he asked after a long pause. "Bress," Dien Sect answered. "The son of Ariu and Elitha. He is of our people and of the Fomorians both. He carries the blood of two worlds." At the name, Tuatha's brow furrowed. He had known Bress, of course, young, proud, striking in form. But there was something about the boy that unsettled him. Bress was beautiful, yes, with golden hair and a voice like honey, but he had always seemed distant, like someone who wore his smile as a mask. But what choice was there? So Tuatha nodded, and word was sent. Bress would be crowned king. The ceremony was held at Timhair, the sacred hill where kings were made. Tuatha, wrapped in a long silver robe, stood to the side, watching as the crown was placed upon Bress's brow. The people cheered, not wildly, but dutifully. They hoped for peace, and Bress, with his Fomorian lineage, might help prevent war with the darker kindred across the sea. And so, the Tuatha Dé Danann moved forward. But not all was well. Bress, for all his beauty and promise, did not rule with generosity. Where Tuatha had walked among his people, listening and laughing, Bress remained aloof. He taxed heavily, demanded tribute from poets and warriors alike, and filled the court with Fomorian advisors whose eyes gleamed with cold ambition. The halls that once rang with music grew quiet. The fields, once blessed by song, felt heavier beneath the sun. Still, Tuatha remained silent. He did not seek to reclaim what had been taken. He wandered the forests, his silver robe trailing in the leaves, or sat beside lakes, speaking to the wind. He was no longer king, but he was still Tuatha. And the land remembered him. Then came Mayak, son of Dien Sect, a young healer filled with a strange, bright magic unlike any the Tuatha had seen. Mayak visited Tuatha one morning with a quiet resolve in his eyes. "You are still king in spirit," he said. "And spirit, I believe, can guide the flesh." Tuatha raised a brow. "What are you saying?" I can make you whole, Mayak replied. Not in the way you were, but in a new way. And so began the work. For 9 days and nights, Mayak labored beside Tuatha. He called upon ancient spells, blended metals with herbs, shaped silver not as a smith, but as a healer. He sang songs as he worked, soft invocations that threaded light into the form he crafted. And when it was done, he bowed it to Tuatha's shoulder with hands that glowed. A hand made of silver, smooth, shining, flexible as flesh. A hand that moved with thought, held with strength, and shimmered in sunlight. Tuatha wept when he touched it for the first time. Not because it was perfect, but because it was his. Words spread quickly. The silver hand. The king who had lost and now stood whole, not by returning to what was, but by becoming something new. The people stirred with hope. Perhaps the laws, once rigid, could bend to wisdom. But not all rejoiced. Dian's sect, proud and bound by tradition, looked upon his son's work with anger. He had been the healer of the gods for centuries, and here was Mayak, surpassing him with ease, humility, and light. In a moment of jealousy and despair, Dian's sect raised his blade and struck Mayak down. The young healer died beneath the yew trees, and flowers sprang from the soil where his blood touched earth. Tuatha mourned deeply, but he did not forget. With the silver hand, he returned not to battle, but to purpose. The people, weary of Brez's cold rule, began to whisper of the old king. The one who listened. The one who stood, even broken. The one who had not taken power, but had earned it through pain and grace. The land, too, remembered. And in the quiet stirrings of root and stone, the winds of change began to rise once more. At first, the reign of Brez had the appearance of harmony. His face, so striking with its flawless symmetry, inspired confidence. He carried himself with poise, with a crown with a regal stillness, and when he spoke, his voice was measured and golden. The Tuatha Dé Danann, still recovering from battle and the sorrow of Tuatha's departure, clung to the illusion of peace he offered. But the land knew better. Slowly, the fields grew quieter. The laughter that once drifted from the sacred halls of Teamhair became hushed. The bards, who once sang by torchlight, now kept their songs inside. And though the skies above air remained blue and endless, there was something uneasy in the air, like the hush before a storm. Brez, son of the goddess Ariu and the Fomorian prince Tuatha, had always straddled two worlds. The Tuatha had once believed this made him a symbol of unity, a bridge between their kind and the Fomorians who dwelled across the sea and deep within the earth. But where Tuatha had ruled with compassion and connection, Brez governed with a cold, calculating eye. His first changes seemed minor. He replaced the stewards of the court with men from his mother's line, Fomorian nobles cloaked in shadowed robes who spoke in low voices and rarely smiled. They came with ledgers, scrolls, and quills, recording every storehouse, every harvest, every coin given in offering. Then came the taxes. Where once the land had given freely, grain to the people, milk to the children, honey to the altars, now every portion was counted, measured, and claimed. Warriors were required to pay for their own weapons. Healers were taxed for their herbs. Even the bards, whose songs were considered sacred breath, were made to labor in the fields that they could not pay in gold. This was not the way of the Tuatha Dé Danann. Their lives had always been a circle of giving, gifts of music, protection, wisdom, and harvest shared freely, for the good of the people and the blessing of the land. But under Bress, generosity was no longer a virtue. It was seen as weakness. He discouraged the telling of old stories, especially those that praised the deeds of Tuatha Dé Danann. He frowned upon festivals, limited gatherings, and posted guards at the sacred wells. Soon, it was not only the people who suffered, but the land itself. The harvests began to fail. The cows gave less milk. The bees disappeared from the hives. The wind carried less song, and even the trees seemed slower to bloom. It was as if the spirit of air had turned her face away in quiet protest. The harmony that once flowed between the people and the land had been severed, replaced with control, with fear, with silence. Still, many endured, hoping the new king would grow into his role, soften with time. But Bress did not soften. He grew sharper. His Fomorian kin, led by his father's brother Baelor the Evil Eye, began to arrive in secret. They did not live among the people. Instead, they gathered in towers at the coast and deep caves beneath the hills. It was said Baelor's eye, hidden behind a heavy lid, could burn an army to ash if ever opened fully. And now, that gaze was turning toward the Tuatha Dé Danann. Bress granted them passage. He opened the ports and turned a blind eye as the Fomorian ships landed with steel and shadow. The peace that had seemed so promising now revealed itself to be little more than a slow occupation. Even the great ones of the Tuatha felt the weight. Adma, once proud and strong, was made to carry stones for Bress's palace. The poet Cairbre, whose verses had once moved hearts to joy and tears, was silenced when he refused to compose false praise. And Tuatha, though no longer king, watched from afar with a heart that ached, not just for the people, but for the dignity they were losing, piece by piece. The people began to whisper again, not in rebellion, not yet, but in longing. They remembered the warmth of Tuatha's court, where truth had walked freely. They missed the music, the storytelling, the gentle rhythm of life before it was measured in coin. And then came the breaking point. One day, Cairbre, the high poet, was summoned to Bress's hall. Though now aged, his voice still carried the power of old magic. Bress demanded a poem, a song of glory to celebrate his rule. Cairbre stood tall, his face lined not just with years, but with truth, and refused. "I will not sing falsehoods for gold," he said, his voice ringing clear across the chamber. Bress's face darkened. "Then speak what you will." And so Cairbre did. Right there, in the center of the court, he recited a satire, a biting, rhythmic condemnation of Bress's tyranny, spoken in the oldest cadence of the gods. It was not just a poem. In the world of the Tuatha Dé Danann, words held power. Praise could lift crops from the soil. A curse, if spoken in rhythm and truth, could wound more deeply than any blade. As Cairbre's voice rose, the very walls of the court seemed to tremble. By the time he was done, silence fell like a stone. Bress turned pale. Though he did not show fear, he felt it. The magic of satire, old and wild, had marked him. The people began to murmur. A poet's curse could not be undone with threats or gold. And now, Bress's aura of control began to crack. The people did not rebel that day. But they remembered. They remembered what it was to live in joy. They remembered the balance, the giving, the celebration of life that once flowed through the land like a gentle river. And slowly, quietly, they began to look toward the forests and hills, where Nuada walked still, silver hand gleaming beneath the moon. He had not taken back his crown, but the people began to wonder if perhaps he should. And far beyond the plains, across the gray sea, Baelor and the Fomorians watched. They saw the stirrings of unrest, the shift in energy, and began to prepare. For Bress was their key, and through him they would open the gate not just to rule, but to conquest. In the shadow of mountains and the silence of starlit fields, the land held its breath once more. Something old was awakening. Something deeper than fear, older than kings. Hope. The silver of Nuada's hand caught the morning light as he stood at the edge of a lake, its water still as glass. Mist curled along the surface like a breath held too long. Around him, birds stirred in the trees, and beneath the earth, the roots whispered, quiet, restless, remembering. It had been many seasons since he had stepped down as king. He had not sought return, nor glory. The wound had shaped him, and in the shaping, he had learned patience. In solitude, he had walked the lands of air, listening to the stories of stones, the dreams of old forests, and the hearts of his people. But now, the wind carried new voices. Voices of sorrow. Voices of resistance. And voices calling his name. The poet Cairbrae's satire had stirred more than just a crack in Bress's court. It had awakened the spirit of the people. Farmers began to leave their harvests at old shrines again. Storytellers began to meet in secret circles, sharing tales not just of Bress, but of Nuada, of Danu, of the ancient ways. Small acts, almost invisible, but together they wove a quiet rebellion. Nuada felt it. He did not return to the halls of Teamhair with an army or a command. He walked in silence, his cloak the color of clouded sky, his silver hand covered beneath long sleeves. He visited the villages Bress's tax collectors had drained. He healed the sick with gentle magic. He knelt beside broken altars and whispered blessings older than language. And everywhere he went, eyes widened. He had returned. Not as a king, as a guardian. Bridget met him beneath a rowan tree, her braid streaked now with silver, but her spirit bright as ever. She embraced him with arms that had held hundreds of wounded, and her tears wet his shoulder. They sing of you, Nuada, she whispered, in low voices. Around small fires. They wait for you to rise. Nuada touched the bark of the rowan tree, feeling the pulse of old magic running through its trunk. I will not rise alone, he said. Not as I was before. The world has changed. And change it had. The Tuatha Dé Danann, once radiant in ease and celebration, were weary now. Yet their weariness had carved new strengths into them, resilience, wisdom, unity. No longer scattered in high halls and sacred groves, they began to come together. Adma, strong again after his forced labor, lifted stones once more, but now as a symbol of the burden shared by all. He gathered young warriors, training them not only in battle, but in honor. He welcomed farmers, artisans, poets, any who wished to defend their home, not just fight for a crown. Bridgie traveled with Nuada, tending to wounds both old and new. Her presence was a balm, her words like warm water on aching hands. She reminded them all that healing was resistance too. And in the quiet heart of the sacred woods, Nuada met a young man with eyes like stormlight, Luff, son of Kian of the Tuatha Dé Danann and Ethniu, daughter of Baelor. The boy was lean and swift, with a light in him that shimmered like a blade yet unsheathed. Nuada studied him carefully. "You are of two worlds," he said. "Like breaths." Love did not flinch. "But I choose who I serve. And I choose the people. I choose the light." There was a calm fury in his voice, like the sea waiting for a storm. Adma had told Nuada of the boy's skills: swordsmanship, poetry, healing, music, craft, insight. Love could do all things, and more than that, he did them with purpose. Nuada saw something else in him too. Not just talent. Destiny. "We will need you," Nuada said simply. And so, the quiet rise began. Across the lands of air, messengers passed in shadow, not with calls to war, but invitations. Return. Remember. Resist. They did not promise victory, they promised hope. The people responded. Old forges, long silent, burned bright again. Swords were not made in haste, but with reverence. Shields were carved with the symbols of Danu, of the sacred sun, of unity. Women and men, elders and youth, gathered in circles beneath the stars, listening to the plans drawn by those who remembered not just how to fight, but why. Nuada remained among them, not above, but beside. His silver hand, once seen as a flaw, had become a beacon. Children touched it with awe. Warriors swore oaths upon it. It was proof that the broken could be made whole, not by returning to the old shape, but by becoming something truer. Even the land responded. Wherever the resistance gathered, flowers bloomed early. Crops grew thicker. The air smelled richer, sweeter. The spirits of air had not abandoned them, they had only waited, watching, for the people to find their way back. But not all watched in silence. From his stone fortress on Tory Island, Baylor stirred. He had heard the whispers. He had seen the clouds gather above the Tuatha once more. And his eye, sealed behind that heavy lid, twitched in its sleep. Beside him, Bress knelt. No longer cloaked in golden robes, he looked leaner, harder. His pride had curdled into something darker. "They gather again," he told Baylor. "My rule is threatened." Baylor did not move. His voice, when it came, was slow and deep, like the creak of old ice. "Then you will crush them. We will march. And this time, we do not stop at tribute. We take the land itself." The Fomorians began to prepare, not in silence, but in strength. War drums echoed in the deep caves. Ships were built of blackened wood. Beasts of the sea were summoned. And Baylor's eye, beneath its lid, began to warm with fire. But Nuada was ready. He stood beneath the sky, beside Bridget, Adma, Luff, and the many others who had remembered what it meant to live with honor. They did not raise arms in anger. They raised them in defense of balance. In defense of each other. The return of Nuada was not a march. It was a rising, quiet, steady, and filled with light. And somewhere in the distance, across mountain and mist, the sound of a harp drifted on the wind, and the land, ever watchful, ever wise, began to sing again. The mists lifted slowly over the wide, open plain of Mag Twyard, revealing a land caught in the quiet breath before battle. The grass swayed under a wind not yet burdened with war cries, and clouds gathered low in the sky, heavy with more than rain. Beneath them stood the people of the Tuatha Dé Danann, not as conquerors, but as defenders of land, of life, of balance. It had taken many moons to reach this day. Tuatha stood at the front of the host, his silver hand glinting in the gray light. Armor wrapped his frame, light yet strong, forged in silence by the finest crafters of the Danann. His eyes were calm, his expression not fierce, but resolute. He did not hunger for victory, he stood for what must be preserved. Beside him stood Love, radiant as the first morning, the spear of light at his back pulsing with the heartbeat of the sun itself. He had grown in strength and wisdom since the day Tuatha met him under the trees. Now, there was a fire in him, controlled, but burning deeply. The warriors whispered of him already as Samildanak, the many-skilled one who carried the fate of gods and mortals alike in his hands. To Tuatha's left stood Ogma, his arms like carved stone, eyes fierce but not cruel. To his right, Brigid, not clad in armor, but in the light of the sacred flame, her presence a balm to the soldiers who tightened their grips on spears and shields. The Tuatha did not march in neat, rigid lines. They stood in flowing ranks, each group linked not just by orders, but by trust, by love, by shared memory. Druids murmured enchantments, weaving light into shields. Bards sang quietly to keep fear at bay. Women and men, young and old, warriors and weavers alike, stood together. Across the plain, the Fomorians gathered like a storm. Their ships had landed days ago, black-hulled and sharp as blades. Their banners bore the twisted symbols of the deep, serpents, broken moons, and the eye that burned. The ground beneath them seemed darker, and the wind carried the scent of cold iron and blood. At their center stood Balor, tall as a twisted tower, his face hidden beneath a heavy bronze helm. The lid over his evil eye was sealed tight, for now, but even closed, it hummed with heat. Around him moved creatures born of shadow and sea foam, warriors with scaled skin, beasts with many arms, and great hounds whose howls could shatter bone. And at Balor's side stood Briss. Dawn was the beauty that once deceived a court. His face was pale now, tightened with resentment. He wore armor too fine for a warrior who had never earned it. Yet he smiled, confident that the power he had summoned would crush the will of those who had cast him out. As the sun reached its peak behind the clouds, the silence broke. A single horn call rose from the Fomorian side, low, guttural, echoing off the stones. Then came the answering cry from the Tuatha, a high, clear tone like a bird's call at dawn. The ground seemed to pulse beneath their feet. The battle began not with a roar, but with a wave. The Fomorians charged first, beasts and soldiers moving as one, hurling dark blades and curses as they ran. The Tuatha met them with calm precision. Spears struck shields, swords clashed, and the quiet field erupted into chaos. Tuatha moved like water through the fray. His silver hand struck with strength matched only by its grace. He did not rage, he danced, every movement a lesson in balance. He fought beside his people, never above them. Every time one faltered, he was there. Every time a line threatened to break, his voice steadied it. Ogma wrestled with a Fomorian giant near the riverbank, their roars shaking the very trees. The giant's club shattered stones, but Ogma's fist struck with the might of mountains, each blow echoing with the language of power. His strength came not just from muscle, but from meaning, from the unbreakable will to protect. Brigid moved through the field like a flame in the wind, untouchable, yet everywhere. Where warriors fell, she knelt beside them, her hands glowing softly. Some she healed, returning them to the fight. Others she closed the eyes of, whispering peace. Her presence was a promise that no one would be forgotten. And Love was the spear of dawn. He leapt into the heart of the enemy line, wielding not just weapons, but music, memory, and vision. Every time he struck with every skill the Tuatha had ever known. He moved with the elegance of a dancer and the fury of a storm. Balor had not yet entered the battle. He watched from a high stone platform, his eyelid trembling. He waited for the right moment, not to fight, but to end. For when Balor's eye opened, all life within its gaze would wither and die. Then the turning point came. Tuatha, ever at the front, met Bres on the field. The former king sneered. "You fight for shadows, Tuatha. The age of gifts and balance is over." Tuatha did not reply. He simply raised his blade. Their duel was short. Bres was clever, trained, and armored, but he did not fight with purpose. Tuatha struck cleanly, disarming him. He did not kill him. "I fight for what you forgot," Tuatha said softly. "We do not rule to be feared. We serve to protect." He left Bres kneeling in the dust. But Balor had seen enough. The giant stepped down from his platform. His army rallied behind him, their confidence swelling. As he walked, the earth beneath his feet cracked. When he reached the center of the battlefield, he began to lift the lid from his eye, and the world seemed to hold its breath. The air thickened. Warriors froze. Light dimmed. Even the sky seemed to darken as the lid began to rise. And then, Love appeared. The young warrior climbed high upon a hillock, facing his own grandfather across the battlefield. Their eyes met, one ancient, one young, both unyielding. Balor's eye opened fully. The beam of destruction burst forth, white-hot, hungry, turning stone to ash. But Love was ready. He hurled his spear, not with brute strength, but with precision, guided by every gift he had ever received. The spear flew through the burning light, piercing the evil eye before its power could consume. Balor screamed, a terrible, shaking cry that echoed across the plain. His body collapsed with a tremor that shook the very roots of the earth. And with that, the tide turned. The Fomorians, seeing their greatest weapon fall, faltered. The Tuatha surged forward, not with vengeance, but with purpose. They pushed the invaders back, drove them toward the sea. By dusk, the battle was over. The plain of Mag Tuired was quiet again, scarred, but free. And as the stars emerged above the weary land, the Tuatha Dé Danann stood together once more, not in triumph, but in unity. They had not fought to conquer. They had fought to remember, to restore. And so they did. The first light of morning bathed Mag Tuired in a soft golden hue. Where hours before the clash of steel and cry of battle had torn the air, there now hung a profound silence, a silence not of fear or mourning, but of release. The war was over. The Fomorians, broken and scattered, had retreated across the sea, their dark ships vanishing into the morning mist like ghosts returning to shadow. And in their wake, the land itself began to breathe again. The grasses that had been scorched beneath Balor's gaze slowly began to turn green. Birds returned to the trees ringing the battlefield. The air, once heavy with smoke and blood, now smelled of earth, of morning dew, of peace. The Tuatha Dé Danann stood in quiet clusters, their clothes marked with battle, their limbs aching from effort. but their spirits alight. They had not only survived, they had remembered themselves. Tuatha sat on a low stone, his silver hand resting across his knee, watching the light shift over the faces of those he loved. He had fought many battles in his long life, but none had felt as deeply woven into his being as this one. It was not just a clash of armies, it had been a reckoning. And it had been worth every wound. Bridget moved gently among the wounded and the grieving, her touch soft, her voice softer still. She carried no staff or crown, yet wherever she went, people looked to her with reverence. It was not her magic that held their trust, it was her heart. The warmth she brought could not be conjured by spell alone. Ogma stood with his arms slung over the shoulders of two young warriors, laughing in his booming, rough way as he helped them limp toward a resting place. He bore bruises, scrapes, and a deep gash along his ribs, but he wore them like medals, not of pride, but of shared burden. The strength that had once been only muscle was now tempered with love. And love, the child of two worlds, the light spirit's savior, stood atop a small rise, gazing across the field where Balor had fallen. He said nothing. His eyes were not filled with triumph, but with thought. The spear that had slain his grandfather now rested at his side. It did not glow or hum with power, it was silent, as if it too understood the weight of what had passed. Tuatha approached him slowly, his steps light, his silver hand tucked beneath his cloak. "You did not hesitate," Tuatha said softly. "I couldn't," Love replied, his voice quiet. "If I had, he would have burned the world. You saved us all." Love turned to look at him, his eyes calm but serious. "I didn't do it alone." Tuatha smiled. "No, you didn't." There was a long pause, filled only by the breeze stirring the tall grasses around them. Then Love spoke again. "Is it over, truly?" Tuatha nodded once. "The war is. But the healing, that will take time." Love didn't speak, but he nodded in return. By midday, the people of the Tuatha began the long walk home, not to forget, but to rebuild. They did not carry spoils or trophies. They carried memories, lessons, and each other. When they returned to Timhir, the great hill of kings, it was not to crown a new ruler by force, but to gather in circle and speak. The days of one man ruling by strength alone had passed. The Tuatha remembered now that the land was not conquered, it was cared for. And those who would lead must lead not by power, but by service. Tuatha, though many called for him to reclaim his throne, stood before them all and raised his silver hand. "My place is among you," he said. "I was king, and I will always protect this land, but it is time for new voices, for new light." His gaze found Luffa's, and though he said no more, the people understood. A council was formed, with Bridget, Ogma, Diensek the healer, and others, all voices who carried wisdom in different strengths. And among them stood Luff, not as king, but as one who had seen both shadow and dawn, and who would walk beside the people, not ahead of them. The changes rippled outward. Shrines were rebuilt, not to demand worship, but to honor connection. The rivers were clean and blessed, the trees sung to once again. Songs returned to the mouths of bards, not of war alone, but of love, of courage, of the little kindnesses that kept life worth living. And something strange, something quiet but beautiful, began to happen. The spirits of the land, the city, the ancient ones, began to reappear. Not in force or in fury, but in gentle signs, a ring of mushrooms at the edge of a field, a glowing light on the water, the sound of bells in a place where no hand had rung them. The balance had been restored, and with it, the old magic stirred once more. As for Bress, he was not executed, though many had called for it. He was brought before the council, where he stood pale and defiant, expecting wrath. But Bridget stepped forward and asked him a simple question. "What gift can you give the people to make amends?" Bress, unused to mercy, hesitated. Then, slowly, he spoke of farming, of the secrets of the land he had learned from the Fomorians, techniques no one in the Tuatha knew. Bridget nodded and said, "Then teach us." And so he did. It was not forgiveness, but it was a beginning. Seasons passed. Children who had been born during the years of oppression now ran freely across meadows that had once held soldiers. They did not fear shadows anymore. They knew stories of light. Elders sat in the evenings and spoke of Nuada with the silver hand, of Bridget the flame, of Ogma the strong, and of Love who ended the war with a single throw. These stories were not told to glorify, but to remind, to keep the fire of memory alive. And one morning, many years later, Nuada walked alone through a grove of oak trees, now tall and strong. His hair had grown silver like his hand, and he moved more slowly, but his spirit was light. Birds sang around him. The world felt whole again. He knelt by a stream and whispered a quiet prayer, not for power, not for victory, but for gratitude. Then he stood and walked on, disappearing into the trees, into legend. The Tuatha Dé Danann remained, not as distant gods or warriors in marble, but as caretakers of a land that breathed and remembered. And so er lived on, scarred, yes, but singing. Beneath stars, beneath stone, in story and spirit. The light had returned, and it would never be forgotten. Thank you for joining me on this peaceful journey through time. I hope the story of the Tuatha Dé Danann has filled your heart with calm and wonder. As the night deepens and you settle into the quiet of your own space, let the warmth of the tale stay with you. Let it wrap around you like a soft blanket, comforting and still. The world is vast, and while we sleep, it continues to turn. But for now, in this moment, all is peaceful. Take a deep breath, and as you exhale, release any remaining thoughts, allowing your body to soften and relax. May your dreams be gentle, and may you wake in the morning feeling renewed and peaceful. Until next time, when we gather here again, safe and sound. Sleep well.